Welcome to Westferry Times, where we delve into the stories shaping our society. This is the Deep Dive. Here, we take the sources you send us, the articles, research, all the notes you've gathered, and we really try to unpack the key insights. It's your shortcut to getting properly informed on complex topics. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really important issue, the UK's treatment of its LGBT veterans. We'll be looking at the history here, the discrimination, the dismissals, even imprisonment that many face despite their service. And we'll look at the current government compensation scheme set up to address these past wrongs. But, well, as some of the material you shared makes clear, it's not straightforward. For many veterans, the scheme itself, it feels insufficient, maybe delayed. There are real challenges there. Okay, let's unpack this. Joining me to guide us through the material you've gathered is the campaign lead at Fighting with Pride. That's an organization really dedicated to advocating for these veterans. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's really important to discuss these points, especially based on the material that's been shared with you.
Great. Let's start with the history then, because that context is crucial, isn't it? It's detailed in some of the articles you provided. Could you give us a bit of background on the challenges LGBT individuals faced in the armed forces?
Yes, certainly. The historical context is, well, it's absolutely fundamental to understanding this. As you can see in some of the documents, like the summaries from military archives, from 1967, when homosexuality was actually decriminalized for civilians, the military kept its own ban in place, a specific ban.
Right, so a divergence there.
Exactly. And that policy wasn't lifted until the year 2000.
2000, wow.
So for over 30 years, LGBT personnel faced systematic discrimination. And this wasn't just about being excluded. Many were actively investigated, sometimes quite aggressively. They were often forcibly removed from service, frequently had their ranks stripped, medals confiscated, honors removed. And in, quite shocking cases, even faced imprisonment under military law.
Imprisonment just for who they were.
Precisely. And this policy, it didn't just abruptly end their careers. It created these lasting scars, personal, professional, financial damage that, frankly, affected every part of their lives from that point on.
And it's really striking, looking at the timeline in one of the articles you send over, that this act of discrimination carried on in the military for so long after civilian law changed.
Absolutely. That's a key point. The military was sort of one of the last major UK institutions to scrap this specific policy. And that delay, that really prolonged period of institutional prejudice, has had such a profound, enduring impact on those who served during that time. Their service, which was often, honorable, dedicated service, was effectively just erased or tarnished by a policy that criminalized their identity.
It's quite something to get your head around. Now, a major development, obviously covered in the material, is the government's response, the $75 million compensation scheme. Can you walk us through how that's structured based on the sources?
Yes. So based on the details in, say, the government's official announcement documents, the scheme is intended to offer some form of redress. It provides a sort of flat rate, a baseline payment of £50,000. That's for individuals who are dismissed or significantly impacted in their service purely because of their sexual orientation or gender identity.
Okay, a baseline amount.
Yes. And then there's potential for an additional sum, up to £20,000 more. This is meant for cases where the experiences were deemed particularly severe or, resulted in exceptional hardship. Now, while the existence of the fund itself and the acknowledgement it represents is a necessary step forward, the feedback we see, captured in reports from veterans groups and advocacy organizations you've shared, well, it clearly indicates many veterans feel this just isn't enough.
Not enough given the consequences.
Exactly. Given the lifelong consequences they've dealt with, lost careers, lost pensions, sometimes losing homes, significant damage to their reputation, and of course the ongoing psychological distress. The $50K or $70K, it often doesn't really touch the sides of that lifetime loss.
And the articles you included flags a very specific worry about the actual payouts. It suggests if the estimates of maybe up to 4,000 eligible veterans turn out to be accurate, then the average payout might end up being much lower than those headline figures, perhaps around £12,500 per person. Is that calculation and the concern valid based on what's described in the material?
Yes. That calculation is a significant concern. It's highlighted in several pieces you shared, especially the analysis from advocacy group reports.
Yeah.
It points to a potential, a mismatch between the total pot of money and the real number of people affected.
Right.
If the initial estimates used to set that £75 million figure actually underestimated the true number of veterans impacted by the ban and its fallout, then yes, Logically, dividing that same fund among a larger group would dilute the compensation each person receives.
Makes sense.
Our view, and this is informed by the personal stories we hear constantly and reflected in, the testimonies our organization collects, is that a fair assessment really needs to look closely at the specific harm caused to each individual's life and career. That's the only way to ensure the compensation offered is genuinely adequate redress for the documented loss, not just a simple division sum.
And to really understand that human impact, which is just so vital here, could you maybe share one or two personal stories, something that illustrates the scale of this injustice, or perhaps how the scheme's perceived issues are playing out for individuals? I know one document mentioned David Bonney specifically.
Yes, personal accounts are incredibly powerful for understanding this. The case of David Bonney, which is detailed in that biographical piece you provided, is particularly poignant. He holds the very difficult distinction being the last person known to be imprisoned in the UK simply for being gay while serving in the military.
The last person. That's quite shocking.
It is. Despite his dedicated service, he faced incarceration. And that didn't just end his time in the forces. It left him with a criminal record, a record that followed him, impacting his life, his job opportunities for decades afterwards.
So it's not just a past event, it has ongoing effects.
Absolutely. Stories like David's, they aren't just about one moment of dismissal or punishment. They really illustrate this systemic disadvantage that just compounds over a lifetime. They make a very, very clear case for why comprehensive, meaningful compensation and acknowledgement are so essential. It's not just about money.
Hearing stories like that really brings home the immense emotional, the psychological toll these policies must have taken and clearly continue to take. How does an organization like yours, Fighting with Pride, support veterans dealing with these ongoing challenges, as described in, say, your mission statement or articles about your work?
The toll is profound, yes. And it's often amplified by years of perhaps having to hide who they were or living with a sense of shame or stigma imposed upon them. So as you can see in the information about our work, we try to focus on providing really comprehensive support. This includes offering practical assistance, helping veterans navigate complex processes like, the compensation scheme application itself. That can be quite daunting.
I can imagine.
We also provide access to counseling and mental health support, specifically tailored to their unique experiences, the trauma, the distress linked to their service and dismissal. And critically, we engage in robust advocacy. We work hard to ensure their voices, their experiences, like those documented in the sources you've gathered, are actually heard at all levels of government and in wider society. Beyond supporting individuals, we're constantly pushing for broader policy changes, trying to dismantle the long-term structural effects of these historical injustices.
Okay, turning now to the government's response, particularly to the criticisms that have been raised, which are highlighted in some of the news reports covering the scheme's rollout. How has the government addressed concerns about the scheme's structure, its size, the pace of payments?
Well, the government, through statements referenced in official press releases and so on, has certainly acknowledged that historic wrongs were committed. That's important. And they have increased the size of the compensation fund compared to some initial earlier proposals.
Okay, so there has been some movement.
Yes. Their stated position is that the $75 million fund is intended to provide meaningful redress, and they've set out a process for applications. However, as noted in criticisms from groups like ours and reported in, for example, parliamentary committee hearings you might have seen referenced, there remains significant concern about the speed and the transparency of how it's all being administered.
Speed being a key issue.
A very key issue. Many of these veterans are now elderly. There's a strong feeling, a real urgency, that swift action is needed to provide justice within their lifetimes. Plus, the complexity of actually proving historical discrimination from decades ago. That can be a huge hurdle for veterans trying to navigate the application process. That's highlighted in some guides on applying for the scheme. Finding evidence can be incredibly difficult.
Right, the burden of proof falls on them decades later.
Precisely.
And beyond the purely financial aspect, are there other measures being advocated for? Based on the sources you've looked at, what else is needed to provide justice and maybe some healing for these veterans?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Financial compensation is a necessary part, but it's definitely not the whole picture of justice here. We and others are actively advocating for measures like the restoration of ranks that were stripped solely because of the ban.
Getting their rank back.
Exactly. And it's also crucial to correct service records, to remove any mention of dismissal for sexuality or gender identity. These entries can still cause problems, even decades later, for things like security vetting or just personal dignity.
Makes sense.
Furthermore, public acknowledgments from the government, statements recognizing the honorable service of these individuals, and acknowledging the profound injustice they faced, these are incredibly important for healing, for restoring dignity. These steps, which are discussed in various advocacy papers and proposals, are really about recognition and respect just as much as financial redress.
Okay. So for people listening right now, people who have provided these sources and are following this issue closely, what can they actually do? How can they support LGBT veterans and the ongoing push for full justice based on how organizations like yours are asking for support?
Well, I think the most important thing often starts with raising awareness, just sharing the information, the kind of details contained in the sources you've gathered today, making sure people understand the history, understand the ongoing impact. That creates crucial pressure for meaningful action. Awareness really is key.
Spreading the word.
Yes. And engaging with organizations like Fighting with Pride, perhaps through channels mentioned on our website or other materials, that's a very practical way to offer support, stay informed, maybe volunteer time or resources. Also, contacting your local member of parliament. Armed with the facts, the information from the sources you've reviewed, express your support for fair, comprehensive compensation and these other forms of redress we've discussed. That political pressure is vital.
Using their voice.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
fundamentally, just keep sharing these stories, this history. Ensure the experiences, the sacrifices of these brave individuals are not swept under the carpet or forgotten. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss this.
No, thank you for guiding us through these really complex issues and the material provided today. It truly helps shed light on the layered challenges still faced by so many LGBT veterans. So that concludes today's deep dive, looking at the sources you provided on LGBT veterans compensation.